So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the language of menus, but before we get onto the language of menus, I want to talk about the differences between speaking and writing. One main difference, of course, is that speaking is transient, it's ephemeral. Unless we're recording it, of course, but for the most part our conversations are here and then they're gone. Whereas writing leaves some kind of permanent record, although of course the permanence might be variable. What we know, of course, in the digital age, how difficult it is to actually get rid of those Facebook pages, to get rid of that writing. Okay, so let's just go through the differences. The first one I just mentioned there is the fact that writing is transient, or that speaking, I beg your pardon, is transient versus the permanence of writing. Sometimes we have situations like a written menu on a blackboard here, which of course is pretty transient, but at least it lasts for a day, maybe a bit longer, and it can be cleaned over, as opposed to something which is indelible, which cannot be got rid of so easily. Second difference in between speaking and writing is we say that speaking is additive or rhapsodic, that it keeps repeating a particular structure. And this is pretty evident in the way that in stories, telling a story in narration, we kind of join with a conjunction and. So this is a young girl who's talking about a bicycle accident she had one time. I was riding my bike with my dad and my little sister, and I was going down a hill awfully fast, and I hit a manhole, and I went over my handlebars, and I fell right on top of my head and landed on the left side of my face. Okay, so that's the kind of way we add thoughts together when we're speaking. We add them with and conjoin them with conjunctions like and. But that's not how we would actually write. If we wrote a sentence like that, it'd be awfully repetitive and boring, and we would go back and probably edit it. A third difference is what we call aggregative, or the use of formulaic expressions. And a lot of speaking is made up of these prefabricated formulaic expressions which we use, and then we use creative language to knit them together. So for example, we have what are called chains or adjacency pairs, where one person says something and it suggests a particular response. So, have you heard? Heard what? The news. What news? I got it. Got what? A phone. Cool. Okay. And this is the notion of what I've says at the bottom there, emphatic communion or emphatic communication. Most of the kinds of speaking we do are done to maintain social relationships. So when you meet somebody, you greet them. And even if you see them again an hour later, you still greet them again. Maybe it's slightly different. And if you see them again in the afternoon, you still greet them. If you don't greet them, then the other person will think, what's the matter? What have I done? Did I say something wrong? Okay, so that's the nature of emphatic communication or emphatic communion. Language in the form of speaking is used to maintain social relationships, face-to-face social relationships. A lot of language is what we call redundant or copious. That is, we say the same thing a lot of the time to achieve a particular result. And you can have a look at this on, if you go on to the other PowerPoint, the non-QuickTime one, you can click on that link and have a look at this scene from a movie called The Big Night, a great scene called the hot dog scene. in which the cook, Primo, is complaining because a customer wants spaghetti with meatballs. And of course, that's kind of beneath his particular skills as a chef. He aims for something higher than that. Anyway, have a listen to that and listen to the way that the nature of the repetition, the nature of how much redundant language there is when we communicate together in spoken language. Of course, in writing, of course, we can edit. We can edit out all those repetitions, all those repetitions of what we've said already in different forms. We use redundant language in speaking because we want to negotiate meaning. We want to communicate our particular intent. And to do that, it's not always easy, so we have to use a lot of language, a lot of repetition to do it. Fifth difference is, given the fact that we have time to compose and edit, then writing is grammatically compact and lexically dense. Okay. Notice the restrictive relative clauses that can be used in writing, which you don't find in speaking. Here's an example. The rules developed here have environmental constraints that are important to some speakers but not applicable for others. So that's a restricted relative clause with that, which we probably wouldn't use in spoken language. Think also of indirect questions. It's important to ask whether a given theory deals only with the kinds of cognitive skills that children acquire normally. So the whether there is what we call an indirect question. Okay? Instead of posing the question, we can do it indirectly. And these are all kind of very dense, structurally complex ways of using language that we can only achieve when we have time to think, and that is in a written format. When we're speaking, we don't use complex grammar. We don't use fancy words like applicable in cognitive. A sixth difference is that speaking tends to be people-centered because it's mainly conducted in a face-to-face situation, where writing is more topic-centered. We can make this distinction in a slightly different way. We can call it ego involvement. Okay, so in speaking, we have lots of uses of first-person and second-person pronouns. I mean, like everyone was shocked. So the I mean is reflecting on the self, right? It's people-centered, so it's what we call ego involved. And we can also be involved with the hearer. I mean, you should do that. When we look at written language, what we find is that those kinds of use of personal pronouns tend to be avoided. We have a lot more use of passives. Here's an example. Thus, the styles of the participants can only be judged as they surfaced in interaction with these participants. So we're avoiding the I's, the U's, and that's the nature of topic-centered discourse, which is indicative of the written form of the language. One major difference, of course, between writing and speaking is that that writing is context reduced, and speaking is context dependent. When we speak, especially in a face-to-face situation, we have a visual frame. We're in a particular physical situation. We can see things about us. We can point to things. Whereas when you're writing, the person you're writing to, the audience, do not have that context. So you have to create that context. And that requires a lot more complex language. You can also have a look at this scene, if you don't know, this very famous scene from When Harry Met Sally, to give you an example of the nature of context-dependent language. So in this famous scene, Sally, they're in a restaurant, and Sally says, well, Harry, Harry doesn't believe that a woman can fake an orgasm. So Sally says, okay, I can do it. I'm going to do it now. much to Harry's embarrassment. And so Sally fakes this orgasm, and the woman who's sitting at the back there, you can see her in the background, and in the lower picture she's in the front ground. The waiter comes round and she says, I'll have what she's having. So that is context dependent, right? And the waiter understands exactly what she's referring to because of the context. If it's context reduced, then you would have to say something like, I'll have the pan-fried northern halibut with fennel and green olive relish, Romano beans, cauliflower, and new potatoes. Okay, so that's a written form, as opposed to what she's having. Okay, so another way of looking at writing and speaking, and not to see it completely as two separate mediums, is that there are overlaps. We can actually distinguish speaking and writing according to whether it's planned or unplanned. So if something's planned, it's more literate. If it's unplanned, it's more orate. Okay, so if we look at speaking, we know the conversation is unplanned. Okay, but what about the written form of a text message, an email? Especially text messages, they're pretty spontaneous, and so we know that a text message has more of the features of, say, oral communication than it has of written communication. And then if we look at planned communication, think of a lecture. A lecture should be something that's thought out and thought about and planned beforehand. So a lecture, although it's delivered orally, really has a lot of features of written language. And of course, if we look at writing, which is highly planned, think about an academic article, a scientific article, which has been edited and pored over and revised and worked over many, many times to reach the particular final submission. We can make an important distinction between text and discourse, okay? Which is not always easy to see. A text refers to a stretch of written language as a product of an identifiable authorial intention. Authorial, fancy word for somebody intended to write it, to speak it, okay? And its relationship to the context of culture is fixed and stable. So that's a notion of language as text without any kind of interaction with it, which might change the particular meaning of it. Discourse, on the other hand, arises out of an interactive process of reader and text. Okay? And discourse involves a shifting social context. So it's interactive. The meanings that come out of the text may change over time depending upon who the reader is. Let me give you an example. The document on the right there is a manifest. It's a slave manifest of a ship. Okay, this is from 1821. It's a ship called the Ohio. These manifests were kinds of documents that ship owners and captains had to complete, showing what they were carrying. Okay, so this manifest shows two enslaved females, Betsy and Harriet, being transported from New Orleans to Philadelphia in 1821. So a manifest is a list of passengers or cargo aboard a ship. So it has the quality of being text at the time because it's a document you have to, if you're running a boat moving cargo people, you have to have this manifest, okay? And that's the text at the time, and there's a fixed interpretation of it. Okay, well, let's go forward 150, 200 years to today, more or less, and look at the manifest again. The manifest now becomes a document which is incredibly important for historians and also for people interested in tracing their family trees, because we can identify these people and we can find something about how the slave trade worked. So now it has historical importance. Now it becomes discourse because the reader is interacting with the text in a totally different way to what it was originally intended to do. Let's bring that up to date. And on the right there is a receipt I got from Kroger. And you get that receipt, what do? You stuff it in your pocket, stuff it in your wallet. It's just text. You don't pay any attention to it, unless you feel as though you've been overcharged and you want to check how much you spent. But for the most part, it's kind of meaningless. Think again in terms of the manifest and how later that document becomes so important for historians to understand the slave trade. Maybe in 50, 100 years' time, this will be a document that's incredibly important for understanding food habits. What did I buy there? It's a little hard to see. Looks like I bought some raspberry spread, some bread, cat food. Oh, okay, so I got a cat. And I can't see what the other one is there. So it tells us something about the daily habits of people. Of course, if you were a detective and you wanted to understand something about maybe somebody who was a suspect, then you could begin to look at this in a totally different way. So that's the nature of discourse. It's an interaction between what the reader brings and what the text brings. It's not just text. It's text when it's in your wallet or in your pocket and you pay no attention to it. It's a piece of text. Once you start reading it with a particular intention in mind, it becomes discourse. So if we want to look at our discourse, we can look at, for example, the discourse of recipes, the discourse of cooking. And when we do that, a distinction can be made between small d discourse and big D discourse. Okay? So what we're trying to get at here is that discourse with a capital D refers not only to ways of speaking, reading, and writing, but also of behaving, interacting, thinking, valuing, that are characteristics of a specific discourse community. Okay, so a discourse community not only uses discourse, language, to communicate with each other, but that discourse carries a whole set of values, a whole set of ways of behaving. So if you think of Paula Deen there, the discourse is of recipes and cooking, but there's a whole set of other values which probably overlaid on her approach to Southern cooking and the kinds of choices and food choices that go into her particular dishes. And of course also there's a discourse being promoted as a reaction to her particular style of cooking. So discourses are ways of being in the world, or forms of life which integrate words, acts, values, beliefs, attitudes, social identities, as well as gestures, glances, body positions, and clothes. So all those signs, all those semiotic signs, body positions, clothes, the way you speak, all feed into the notion of discourse with a capital D. That is not just the language, but a whole set of beliefs and ways of behaving. Here's one example of it, and this is the notion of food and identity. Here's a magazine called Sister Vegan, which is devoted to black female vegans. So here we can see that the discourse is with a capital D because it's expressing a whole set of ways of behaving in the world, of being in the world, or having an identity in the world. Okay? So aspects of group and individual identity are expressed through the discourses that we are involved in. Okay, so think of things in terms of food. Well, we make decisions about what we can and cannot eat, and we know that there are certain foods that carries certain kinds of prestige. And there is also discourses in which about food in which we are expected to know certain things about what we're eating. So let's just take this quote from Lakoff. Discourse of all types is a potent creator and enforcer of identity, and it is the sum of our daily linguistic interactions that to a very large degree creates us and recreates us continually. Okay, so we've moved a long way from text. We've moved to the notion of interaction and the creations of meanings, and then to the notion that the kinds of discourses we like to involve ourselves in, that we use, are part of our social identity. We're identifying who we are. We're pronouncing to the world who we are through what we say and what we do. So let's try and connect that to the language of menus. And before we do that, just a point that we often talk about speech events, that is the kinds of things that happen in the world where we use speaking, like a lecture, like a religious service, etc. And we can also think in terms of literacy events, and those are events which do use not only writing, not only speaking, but writing too. They may be intertwined, but they involve a lot of literacy. So a lecture probably involves an interaction with text. A religious service maybe is a reading from a sacred text. Think of things like soccer reports, where you may have gone to the game and now you're reading about it. Okay, or even discussion boards. It doesn't have to be soccer; it could be any sport you want, in which you are writing and responding to what you have done. So the notion of a menu is a literacy event. Okay, so we go out to eat, and we're given the menu, and we interact with that on the level of a literacy event. So menus are what we can call, in terms of the written form, a genre. We often use register as well, which is more often used for the spoken particular events. Genre more used for a written event, a written literacy event. So what is it? It's an established, prototypical, conventionalized way of performing a literacy event. And so we've already looked at recipes, and now we're looking at menus. And there's a typical menu on the right. Notice how it's organized, and the headings are soups and salads, appetizers, entrees. And already that's telling you that it's a particular type of genre. It's in a particular type of register that you might identify with, or you might not. Here's a menu, and this is from a restaurant, very famous restaurant in San Francisco called Chez Panisse, which began about 20 years ago. And notice with this particular menu, there are no headings. There's no soups and salads, there's no entrees, there's no starters. There's just a space between them, right? So we do have what we could identify as appetizers, then we have main courses, and then we have some desserts. You can come back and have a look at this menu. This is just an extract from the menu, but you can have a look at this at your length. You can pause and read that. What I want to do is just show you how we can begin to analyze that particular menu in terms of particular features. We can begin to discover the particular genre of this particular type of menu. So on the left there, I've given you certain features of menus: list format, past participle modifiers, tasty adjectives, article omission, foreign languages, and then a kind of other miscellaneous category. So what we can note here is that there are no headings, and it's only divided into 3 sections by spaces. So that in itself is a marker of this type of discourse. Notice the use of past participle modifiers: roasted, shaved, grilled, poached, grass-fed, stone ground. Pretty fancy words, right? Which tell you something about the nature of the food that you might impress you and make you feel at home in this particular restaurant. It might feed into your identity of who you are in terms of the food you like to eat. The next category is tasty adjectives. Notice they get interesting, like gingery, bittersweet. A lot of menus omit articles, and those tend to be for actually cheaper restaurants, but the more expensive ones, which this one is, tends not to omit articles. Notice there's a lot of writing in this menu. It tends to be that the more expensive the restaurant, the more writing there is on the menu. The cheaper, the less writing. Notice the use of foreign languages. There's a lot of foreign languages. And again, if this is what you're identifying with, these kind of use of these words reassures you this is the restaurant you want to be in. It reflects your identity of yourself through this particular type of discourse. So we've got mignonette, prosciutto, salad juif, confit, rigatoni, alla puttanesca, olio nuovo, creme chantilly, which can be very off-putting if you're going into a restaurant and you can't read it, you can't make sense of it. So for some people interacting with this kind of menu, it could be off-putting, and for other people it could be reassuring of their identity. In the miscellaneous part, there's 2 things there we can look at. Notice the names of producers of the food: Six Hog Island, Bellwether Farm, Wolf Ranch. So this is suggesting that these are local small producers. It's not Kraft, General Mills, Heinz, but it's small farms. So again, which suggests something about the food, something about the identity that you want to have when you go into this restaurant. And also the use of the preposition with. So in terms of a piece of writing, this is not just text telling you what the food is, but it's also discourse. The way you interact with it makes it into a discourse, in the sense that it may reassure you this is the kinds of food you want to be eating. This is the kind of identity you want to project onto yourself. Or it may not be. So we've come a long way in terms of talking about speaking and writing, and the difference between text and discourse, and the use of discourse and food in terms of self-identity.